Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Here's what's at issue this week. Canada's premiers are set to meet next week to discuss the Trudeau government's healthcare offer. Provinces are still saying it's not enough money, but even premiers who have been vocal opponents of the Prime Minister seem ready to take it.
It will be helpful. So we're going to be making sure we don't leave any money on the table. But I will just express on behalf of all the First Ministers, they had anticipated that it would be a higher share.
After saying this was just a starting point on Tuesday, Doug Ford is hopeful a deal will now be reached.
It makes it a lot easier when you have a great partner like our federal government and the two ministers here working with us, and it's just part of the process. And we'll get this done.
So what's to be made of the Premier's response to the healthcare deal and how Ottawa has handled it all? Let's bring in our panelists, Chantal Hebert, Althia Raj, and joining us this weekend for Mr. Coyne, Paul Wells. Glad you could all be here. I do feel like 2 days has made some sort of incredible change for many of these premiers, who some of them, I mean, Doug Ford in particular, didn't sound that warm to what was on the table, and now everyone has sort of, maybe embraced is too strong a word, but they're certainly welcoming it. Chantal?
Yes, I think the assumption on Tuesday that this round is over, for whatever it was worth, is over. The premiers had two requests going into this for 2 years. They wanted no strings attached, and they got that. They also wanted the moon, and it didn't get delivered. And whether that was a smart negotiating position to start from the moon and climb down, we're seeing this week that whatever common front there was, it's now gone. That meeting of the premiers was supposed to take place on Friday.
Yeah.
It's now scheduled for Monday. You kind of wonder whether it will ever take place.
Well, or what the point of it is at all, Althia, at this point. I mean, I don't know what they have to say other than how much do I get for my side deal.
When you were just airing those clips, I thought, like, what did they put in the water during that press conference? Like, how did this come about? It's a little flabbergasting when you think that they have been lobbying for this for basically 2.5 years. This is the demands that were put forward during the pandemic that were punted and punted again, and then the premiers got together and put, a cross-country ad campaign shaming the government into not coming to the table, and they're getting a fraction of what they wanted. But, I think Chantal said this, or something like it on Tuesday, like, they're not really negotiating here. They're basically beggars. And so they have to take what the federal government has offered them. There is, I'm not sure, there's a political win for the government in the sense that it's off the table. Yeah. But for a prime minister that also suggested that there were going to be outcomes and results and change, I'm not convinced that this is the money that is going to deliver change, because fundamentally, none of the provinces actually want to engage in the change that needs to happen in order to make the system sustainable. And that's a bigger conversation that, frankly, we're not having.
Paul?
This is a huge political win for Justin Trudeau and the federal Liberals. Not only is there not a single premier who is making any fuss at all about this, I was going to say deal, but it's not a deal, it's an announcement.
Yeah.
But the opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre, has already said that if he were to become prime minister, he would continue to implement this policy. So, I am left to quibble about process. I'm astonished that the prime minister conned the premiers into coming to Ottawa to listen to an announcement he could have sent them by email. That is the furthest thing from executive federalism, the way I studied it back in the 20th century. And I'm amazed by the sort of rhetorical shift. The Prime Minister and the Health Minister have spent most of the past month saying that the system is broken and it needs root and branch regenerative change. And they have not begun to put any kind of sum or process on the table that would produce that. The money that's on offer for these sort of separate bilateral side deals, I picked a province at random, Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan's annual health budget is 71 times as much as the feds are offering for bilateral deals. That won't change anything. But so what? I mean, if no one's complaining, I don't get to complain, I guess.
Well, that's why you're here. You can complain if you want. Chantal, your turn.
It might have been different if someone had showed up at that meeting wearing clothes that were not those of an accountant, as in I want money, and some challenge to the way things work. But everyone showed up basically saying, we want to repeat the same behavior that we've been exhibiting for a decade and a half, and we just want more money to continue to replicate it. So when you look, and here I'm not looking at the federal government, I'm looking at the premiers. If there is leadership to make the fundamental changes that would have to be made to improve the system, it was not on offer at the provincial table. And I do not believe that the federal government, that one or any federal government, is in a position to micromanage change in the Canadian health system.
So to be fair to the provinces, I have talked to enough premiers and health ministers to say that they are doing things to try and fix the system, whether it be recruiting people or setting up
every
team
day, all
care.
the time.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
So
of them.
But why is that not
but
something that we can seize on as Canadians in terms of changing or improving the system?
Because that's thinking inside the box. That's setting aside every single report except the Romano report, which said do more of the same, and never questioning some of the fundamental assumptions that underlie the let's hire more people or let's fire more people. It depends which day of the week you're actually talking to provinces in this file. It was the fashion to tell nurses to retire in Quebec a couple of decades ago, and that was supposed to be genius.
Yeah.
And now, we don't have enough nurses, so the genius thing is to find them all over the world. That is not reform. That's basically trying to get to the next election with less bad outcomes.
Or putting a Band-Aid on things. Althia?
Well, that's the problem. The problem is that governments think in election cycles, and the change that we need has to be over the long run, and it requires a lot of investments from the get-go, and that government that implements that change is not going to see a payoff. And so what incentive do they have in the system to do those change, to bear the brunt of like changing the way doctors are paid, for example? Like, who wants to go through all those battles and not get to reap the fruits of their labor down the road? So we are basically just buying them a new box of Band-Aids so they can kind of fix and patchwork the system where it is. And yes, I'm not taking anything away from some of the provinces that have changed the way, for example, doctors function in Alberta, in Ontario. But we need much more change than what the provinces are actually contemplating. And I think one of the things that we've seen with these agreements is that the government came to that realization that they were not going to be able to get change. They were not going to be able to force outcomes. And so in some ways, both sides won. I guess maybe that's the beauty of the federal system that we have, that things worked out the way perhaps they're supposed to. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure patients, Canadians, are really getting the big value here.
So 10 years from now, unless some of us have gone on and retired, we're just going to have the same conversation, Paul? Like, we're not going to see any of the outcomes that we've been talking about and worrying about?
I doubt this deal announcement thing will last a full decade. The rate of growth in the back half of the schedule is so low that I think a future government would need to revisit it.
Yeah.
But I mean, meanwhile, life goes on and change goes on. I have a friend who had major brain surgery recently and was home from the hospital within a few days. Hospital stays are shorter than they ever were. Ambulatory care, multidisciplinary health teams, all of this stuff happens, and it is sure not a federal health minister whose department does not even have the addresses of the hospitals in New Brunswick who's going to inflect that path. I mean, one of the things we may have learned this week is that the state of Canadian healthcare is not a question to which federalism is a useful answer. It's essentially off topic.
Chantal, you can have 20 seconds. Yeah.
So optimistic scenario over the next 2-3 years with that new influx of money helping. Someone in some province will think of different ways of doing things that others will want to imitate. And on the basis of results, the premiers will come back to the federal government saying, look at what we could do if we had a bit more money for it.
Welcome to another round of At Issue. During his State of the Union speech, President Joe Biden pushed his government's Buy America policies.
Tonight, I'm announcing new standards that require all construction materials used in federal infrastructure projects to be made in America. On my watch, American roads, bridges, and American highways are going to be made with American products as well.
Canada's ambassador to the U.S., Kirsten Hillman, is confident Canada will receive exemptions from whatever he puts forward.
We've been quite successful over the years in getting exemptions, in having our trade agreements apply to these rules. That's what we're busy trying to do now.
So between this and Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, is the federal government doing enough to keep Canada competitive? Let's bring everyone back. Chantal, Althia, and Paul Wells. Althia, why don't I go to you first? I know that language is we hear often in the United States, certainly from Democrats, who sometimes are more protectionist than Republicans. But do we have the sense that with that language and the Inflation Reduction Act, which Chrystia Freeland was talking about just a week ago, that this country is doing the things it should be doing to respond to that?
I feel like that's an evergreen question, and the question to that would be no. Like, Canada has a huge productivity problem, and we're facing threats from the United States economically, and we have not brought forward anything close to the U.S.'s IRA. So, no. I will say that I was a little bit taken aback by the obvious need that the federal government felt like it had to calm the waters after the State of the Union address by sending the ambassador out to do all the talk shows, to calm people. And clearly this is something that is going to overshadow the president's visit next month. She is right that, we did get at the 11th hour a NEVI exemption on the subsidy changes in the United States. Yep. Canadian lumber has filled in the gap when there hasn't actually been enough American lumber. So we have strong arguments, but it does raise the question that Canada constantly has to go back, and the work always needs to be done. And it's an election. Well, I was going to say an election year, but an election in 2 years. Yeah. So the stakes are quite high to be seen like President Biden is not watering down his words. So I think that's going to be an added challenge for Canadian diplomats. And
yeah, I mean, I think the government points to Biden's visit that we still don't have a date for as evidence that the Americans care about Canada. I don't know that we should say that much about it. But Paul, you weigh in on whether you think, particularly Inflation Reduction Act, like whether we're doing the right things here to respond to some of this.
The Inflation Reduction Act and the European response to the Inflation Reduction Act, which is to put as much money on the table as the Americans are doing, is a substantial challenge. You can find people in this town who are less worried about it than Chrystia Freeland claims to be. If Joe Biden were to resurrect domestic semiconductor manufacturing capacity in the United States, bring it back from the grave, there's a IBM chip factory in Bromont, Quebec, that would almost certainly get a nice share of that business. And so there's ways in which there might be complementarities. On Buy American, there's how we feel about what the president said, and then there's what's been happening while he's been talking. His first State of the Union address was when he announced Buy American. It's been red alert in Canada ever since then. And yet, in the last 2 years of the Trump presidency, Canada-U.S. bilateral trade actually declined. In the first 2 years of the Biden presidency, it went up by 26% in the first year and 19% in the second year. We're trading more than ever. There are sectors, if you're hoping to do well by U.S. infrastructure government procurement, you hope that Ambassador Hillman can get her carve-outs. But in the meantime, the rest of the bilateral economy is doing better under Biden than it was under Trump.
Chantal.
Certainly, by the standards of the challenge that Trump posed to Canada, this is something that Canada has cause to think that it has the knowledge to negotiate. We've seen some of this not only before, but constantly. Yeah. But it also suggests either that friendshoring, the notion that Chrystia Freeland has been promoting, that we should actually consolidate those ties between allies on the economic front rather than go to the lowest bidder. It's either a work in progress or it's something that is happening, as Paul points out, but we shouldn't be talking about it.
But Janet Yellen also talks about friendshoring. So it's obviously something the United States talks about, but I don't know I don't know how to reconcile that with the Buy America rhetoric, I guess is the point.
Well, it's something that they talk about when they're not talking to voters looking down to another election.
Yeah, sure. Does the government's track record in managing Donald Trump and then these issues, Althea, give them, or should that give us some pause that they have a sense of what they're doing?
They've been quite successful. I think one thing to also remember is that this government actually has quite good connections to the Biden White House. So it's not like relationships are terrible. That said, in the Trump era, they also had some pretty good avenues of being able to send their message across. I wonder if some of the impacts of last year's border closures, like in Windsor and Detroit, where you had car companies having to fly their engines to Canada so that they could keep the production lines, if that damage that Chrystia Freeland was talking about during the convoy, lasting damage, one of the reasons the government used to invoke the Emergencies Act, if there are repercussions from that, if that was just a moment in time, or if the things the government warned at the time might actually happen in the negotiations that will occur and that are supposed to occur as of next week when we see cabinet ministers going down in Washington.
But it's also fair. But it's also fair to ask, by the same token, why that the government would maybe be sending the ambassador on every talk show to remind people that it has handled challenges on that front successfully in the past. They do need to highlight some of their successes these days.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Last word to you, Paul.
A bilateral relationship as close and as intense as Canada's and the United States is always going to need maintenance, and it's always going to have irritants, which is why the Trudeau government probably should not have dismantled so much of the elaborate Friends of Canada apparatus that they activated during the Trump presidency. It's not going to be automatic, and they can't coast on the personal relationship between Trudeau and Biden. There basically isn't much. It has to be institutional. It's going to need work. But the top line news is not discouraging.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you being here. Paul, thanks to you.